Dr. Sarah Redfeather's hands trembled as she lifted the small creature from the examination table, her face draining of all color. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her Cherokee features, but nothing could hide the terror creeping into her dark eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the clinic's humming equipment. This isn't a puppy." William "Bear" Thompson, all 6'2" of weathered Alaskan muscle, felt his knees buckle. The amber eyes staring back at him held an ancient wildness that made his blood run cold. Those weren't the trusting brown eyes of a rescued dog. They were the calculating gaze of something that had never been tamed. "What do you mean it's not? It's a wolf pup," Sarah interrupted, her words hanging in the sterile air like a death sentence. "And if you found one alone—" She swallowed hard, glancing toward the clinic's windows as if expecting something to emerge from the Alaskan wilderness. The pack is still out there. Looking for it? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 weeks earlier, William "Bear" Thompson had been counting down the days until the second anniversary of Rose's death, each sunrise bringing him closer to a darkness he wasn't sure he could survive again. The cabin in Cedar Falls, Alaska, felt bigger every morning. At 68, Bear had thought he'd seen enough of life's cruelties during his 30 years fighting fires in Anchorage, but nothing had prepared him for the silence that followed Rose's funeral. Their little corner of paradise, nestled 15 miles from Denali National Park, had become a monument to everything he'd lost. Every morning, he still set 2 coffee cups on the pine kitchen table Rose had picked out at a garage sale in 1995. By noon, he'd pour the second cup down the sink, watching the brown liquid swirl away like everything else good in his life. The ritual had become as automatic as breathing, though breathing itself had gotten harder since she'd been gone. Bear's weathered hands, scarred from decades of pulling people from burning buildings, now trembled slightly as he held Rose's photograph each evening. She'd been his anchor for 30 years, the one person who could make his booming laugh echo through these walls. Without her, the cabin felt like a tomb. His adopted son Jackson had called exactly twice in the past 2 years, both times on Rose's birthday, conversations that lasted less than 5 minutes and left Bear feeling more alone than before. 10 years of estrangement had carved a canyon between them that seemed impossible to bridge. Jack had been their miracle, a troubled 15-year-old who'd lost his parents in a car crash. Rose had seen something in that angry boy that Bear had been too proud to recognize until it was too late. The town of Cedar Falls knew Bear as the man who'd saved 43 lives during his career, but they didn't see him now, talking to Rose's picture, setting her place at dinner, keeping her lavender soap in the bathroom drawers just to catch her scent when he opened them. As September's chill crept through the cabin walls, Bear found himself driving the back roads more often, anywhere to escape the crushing weight of memories. He'd been a man of action his whole life, but grief had made him a prisoner in his own home. The approaching anniversary loomed like a storm cloud, and Bear wondered if this year might finally break him completely. The rain hammered Bear's windshield like bullets as he drove the winding road back from town, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. September 15th, exactly 2 years since he'd first met Rose at Murphy's Diner on this very road. She'd been stranded with a flat tire, and he'd been the fool who'd stopped to help and ended up falling head over heels for a woman who could make him laugh until his sides ached. The anniversary of their first meeting had become another knife in his chest, another date circled in red on his mental calendar of pain. He'd spent the afternoon at her grave, talking to a headstone that never talked back, carrying fresh wildflowers that would be dead within a week. Through the driving rain, Bear's headlights caught something small and dark huddled at the roadside. His first instinct was to keep driving. Alaska was full of roadkill, and he'd seen enough death for one lifetime. but something made him tap the brakes. The shape moved. Bear pulled his pickup to the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires. He sat for a moment, engine idling, watching the small form through his rain-streaked windshield. It was barely bigger than a football, jet-black fur plastered against its tiny body. When it lifted its head, two enormous eyes reflected his headlights like amber jewels. "Well, I'll be jiggered," Bear muttered, reaching for his rain slicker. The creature couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, abandoned on this God-forsaken stretch of highway. What kind of heartless bastard would dump a puppy in weather like this? The rain soaked through his jacket as he approached slowly, hands extended. The little thing didn't run. It just watched him with those impossibly large eyes, shivering so hard Bear could see it from 10 feet away. "Easy there, little fella." Bear's voice carried the same gentle tone he'd once used with frightened fire victims. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." When he scooped the creature up, its weight, or lack thereof, nearly broke his heart. It couldn't have weighed more than 2 pounds, all bones and wet fur. The puppy pressed itself against his chest, seeking warmth, and let out the smallest whimper Bear had ever heard. Something inside him cracked open, something that had been sealed shut since Rose's funeral. Back in his truck, Bear wrapped the shivering creature in an old flannel shirt he kept behind the seat, one of Rose's favorites that still smelled faintly of her perfume. The puppy burrowed into the fabric like it belonged there, and for the first time in 2 years, Bear felt something other than crushing loneliness. "What am I gonna call you?" he wondered aloud, studying the tiny face peering up at him. The puppy's ears were oversized for its head, giving it an almost comical appearance that reminded Bear of Rose's infectious laugh. "She always wanted to name a dog Scout. Said it sounded like an adventure. Scout." The name felt right rolling off his tongue. The drive home passed in a blur of protective instincts Bear thought had died with Rose. He found himself talking to the puppy, explaining the landmarks, promising hot food and a warm bed. Scout listened with those remarkable amber eyes, occasionally making soft sounds that weren't quite whimpers, but weren't quite barks either. At the cabin, Bear's hands shook as he prepared a warm bowl of milk, his firefighter training kicking in as he checked Scout for injuries. The puppy was thin but seemed unharmed, eagerly lapping at the milk with a pink tongue barely bigger than Bear's thumbnail. "Rose would have loved you," Bear whispered, settling into his recliner with Scout curled against his chest. "She always said this place needed the sound of little feet." That first night, when Bear tried to set up a makeshift bed in the kitchen, Scout cried pitifully until Bear relented and let him sleep on Rose's side of the bed. The little body was warm against his ribs, and for the first time since the funeral, Bear slept through the night without nightmares. But even in those early hours, something felt different about Scout. His movements were too fluid for such a young animal, his alertness too sharp. When the wind howled through the pine trees outside, Scout would lift his head and make sounds Bear had never heard from a dog, low, musical calls that seemed to answer something in the darkness. The next morning, Bear's neighbor Pete Morrison stopped by with his usual gruff concern. "Heard you got yourself a dog," Pete said, eyeing Scout suspiciously as the puppy explored the cabin with remarkable confidence. "Found him on the highway," Bear replied, defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Some bastard dumped him in the rain." Pete scratched his graying beard, watching Scout's movements with the eye of a man who'd lived in Alaska his whole life. "That's one hell of an unusual-looking puppy, Bear. You sure about the breed?" "He's just young," Bear snapped, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Mixed breed, probably. Nothing wrong with being different." But Pete's words planted a seed of doubt that Bear tried desperately to ignore. Scout's ears were indeed oversized, his snout more pointed than rounded, his legs longer than they should be for his apparent age. And those eyes. Bear had never seen a dog with amber eyes that seemed to hold such intelligence. As the days passed, Scout's unusual behaviors became harder to dismiss. He refused commercial dog food, preferring the wild salmon bear caught in the nearby stream. He never barked, instead making those strange musical sounds that seemed to carry further than they should. At night, he would sit by the windows, staring out at the darkness with an intensity that made Bear's skin crawl. Most unsettling of all, Scout seemed to respond to Rose's name. When Bear talked to her photograph each evening, Scout would approach and nuzzle his hand, as if offering comfort for a loss he somehow understood. "You're reading too much into it," Bear told himself firmly. Scout was just a smart dog who'd bonded with a lonely old man. Nothing more, nothing less. But late at night, when Scout's eyes reflected the moonlight streaming through the bedroom window, Bear couldn't shake the feeling that something wild and ancient was watching him back. Something that had never been meant for walls and warm milk and human companionship. Something that belonged to the vast wilderness surrounding their little cabin, where wolves still roamed under the northern lights and ancient laws older than civilization still held sway. 2 weeks later, Scout had transformed Bear's world in ways the old firefighter couldn't have imagined. The cabin that had echoed with silence now rang with the soft padding of paws and those strange musical sounds that Scout made instead of barking. Bear found himself talking constantly, to Scout, to Rose's picture, to anyone who would listen about his remarkable companion. But the peace couldn't last. Bear was refilling Scout's water bowl when he heard the rumble of an unfamiliar engine in his driveway. Through the kitchen window, he watched a sleek black SUV pull up beside his weathered pickup truck. The contrast was jarring, like a city predator invading his wilderness sanctuary. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that screamed money rather than experience. His salt and pepper beard was perfectly trimmed, his smile practiced and cold. He moved with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Thompson?" The stranger's voice carried a slight accent Bear couldn't place. "Name's Marcus Blackstone. I hear you've got yourself quite the unusual dog." Bear's instincts, honed by decades of reading dangerous situations, started screaming warnings. Scout, who had been playing with a rope toy, suddenly went rigid, his amber eyes fixed on the stranger with an intensity that made Bear's skin crawl. "Don't know what you mean by unusual," Bear replied, stepping onto his porch but keeping his distance. "Just a puppy I found on the road." Marcus's laugh was like broken glass. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean. May I?" He gestured toward the cabin, already taking a step forward. "Actually, no. Private property." Bear crossed his arms, every fiber of his being rejecting this man's presence. "State your business or move along. Direct. I like that in a man." Marcus pulled out a business card, holding it between 2 fingers like a weapon. "I represent certain collectors. People who appreciate rare and exotic animals. That pup of yours, he's worth quite a bit of money to the right buyer. He's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Mr. Thompson. It's just a matter of price." Marcus's eyes glittered with something ugly. "That little fella could set you up for life. Comfortable retirement. No more worrying about heating bills or medical expenses." Bear felt rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to run into burning buildings. "I said he's not for sale. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender, but his smile never wavered. "No need for hostility, but you should know keeping exotic animals without proper permits is a federal crime. Hefty fines, possible jail time. Shame to see a man your age facing those kinds of troubles." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Bear's hands clenched into fists, muscle memory from his younger days flooding back. You threatening me? Just offering friendly advice. I'll be in touch, Mr. Thompson. Think about what I said. As Marcus drove away, Bear noticed Scout hadn't moved from his rigid stance. The puppy's hackles were raised, and he was making a low, continuous sound that definitely wasn't a growl, but somehow felt more threatening than any dog's snarl. Before Bear could process what had happened, another vehicle pulled into his driveway, a battered pickup truck he recognized with mixed emotions. Jackson Winters unfolded his lanky frame from the driver's seat, looking older than his 38 years, his dark hair showing premature gray at the temples. "Hello, Bear." Jack's voice carried 10 years of distance and regret. "Jack." Bear's throat tightened. His adopted son had filled out since their last meeting, the angry young man replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet authority. "Didn't expect to see you." "I know. I should have called." Jack's green eyes, so much like roses, swept over the cabin, taking in the improvements Bear had made. "Place looks good." An awkward silence stretched between them, 10 years of hurt and stubborn pride creating a chasm that neither seemed capable of crossing. Scout broke the tension by padding over to investigate the newcomer, his earlier agitation forgotten. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack said, crouching down to Scout's level. "Pete Morrison said you'd gotten a dog, but he didn't mention—" He paused, studying Scout's features with the same intensity Marcus had shown. "That's one hell of an unusual-looking puppy, Bear." "So everyone keeps telling me." Bear's defensive walls slammed back into place. "He's perfectly normal." Jack's eyebrows rose at the sharp tone. "I didn't say he wasn't. Just different." He extended his hand slowly, and Scout sniffed it cautiously before allowing a brief touch. "What's his story?" "Found him on the highway 2 weeks ago. Some bastard dumped him in the rain." Bear's voice softened as he watched the interaction. "Named him Scout. Rose always wanted to name a dog Scout," Jack finished quietly. "I remember." The shared memory hung between them, a bridge across the years of silence. Scout seemed to sense the emotional undercurrent moving between the two men like he was trying to connect them. "Mind if I ask why you're here?" Bear asked, not unkindly. Jack stood slowly, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he wanted to say. "Got a call from Tom Bradley yesterday. Sheriff said there'd been some inquiries about you, people asking questions about your unusual dog." "What kind of people?" "The kind that make Tom nervous. And when Tom gets nervous, he calls me." Jack's expression darkened. "Bear, there are some dangerous folks involved in illegal animal trafficking. Wolves, big cats, exotic birds. They're not the kind of people you want to mess with." Bear felt the world tilt slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that puppy of yours might not be what you think he is. And if certain people think he's valuable—" Jack didn't finish the sentence, but the implications were clear. Scout chose that moment to make one of his strange musical sounds, a low, haunting call that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. Both men stared at him, and Bear saw his own dawning realization reflected in Jack's eyes. "Jesus, Bear, when's the last time you took him to a vet? He's healthy as a horse, eating good, sleeping fine." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Jack's voice carried a new urgency. "Has he been checked out by someone who knows what they're looking at?" Bear's mouth went dry. The questions, the strange behaviors, Marcus's obvious interest, pieces of a puzzle he'd been refusing to see started clicking into place. "There's a veterinarian in town," Jack continued. "Dr. Sarah Redfeather. She specializes in wildlife. If anyone would know—" "Know what?" Bear demanded, though part of him already suspected the answer. Jack looked at Scout, who was watching them both with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes. and spoke the words Bear had been dreading to hear. "Whether that's actually a dog you've been raising." The 3 weeks that followed Jack's arrival brought a fragile peace to Bear's cabin, though underneath the surface, tensions simmered like water approaching a boil. Jack had moved into the spare room, Rose's old sewing room, claiming he needed to take some time off work and reconnect with family. Bear didn't buy it for a minute, but having another human voice in the house after 2 years of solitude felt like a blessing he didn't deserve. Scout had accepted Jack's presence with cautious curiosity, though Bear noticed the way his companion watched Jack with those unsettling amber eyes, as if measuring the younger man's intentions. During the day, the three of them fell into an easy routine. Bear cooking breakfast while Jack handled firewood and Scout explored the property with increasing boldness. But at night, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, Scout would pace restlessly by the windows, making those haunting musical sounds that sent chills down Bear's spine. "He's getting bigger," Jack observed one morning, watching Scout demolish a plate of scrambled eggs with startling efficiency. "Lot bigger than he should be for his age." Bear looked up from his coffee, defensive walls already rising. "He's a healthy eater. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong, just observing." Jack's tone was carefully neutral, but Bear caught the underlying concern. "When's the last time you weighed him?" The truth was, Bear hadn't weighed Scout since that first night. The puppy had been so frail, so impossibly light in his arms. Now, after 3 weeks of constant feeding and care, Scout moved with a fluid grace that reminded Bear uncomfortably of the wolves he'd sometimes glimpsed in Denali's backcountry. "He's fine," Bear muttered. But even as he said it, he found himself studying Scout's profile. The snout was definitely more pointed now, the ears larger in proportion to his head. And those legs, Jesus, when had they gotten so long? That afternoon, while Jack was in town picking up supplies, Bear sat on his porch with Scout at his feet, trying to make sense of the growing unease in his chest. The puppy had been chasing butterflies with the clumsy enthusiasm of any young dog, but now he moved with predatory precision, his amber eyes tracking every movement in the surrounding forest. "What are you, little fella?" Bear whispered, scratching behind Scout's oversized ears. "And why do I get the feeling I'm not going to like the answer?" Scout looked up at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes and made a soft sound that might have been comfort or might have been something else entirely. The sound of an approaching vehicle cut through Bear's brooding. He expected to see Jack's truck, but instead Marcus Blackstone's black SUV pulled into the driveway. This time, the man wasn't alone. A second vehicle followed, a white van with tinted windows that screamed government or something worse. Bear's instincts kicked into high gear as he stood, unconsciously placing himself between Scout and the approaching strangers. Scout's hackles rose immediately, and he let out a low sound that was definitely not a bark, but somehow carried more menace than any dog's growl. Marcus emerged from the SUV with his practiced smile, but his eyes were cold as Arctic ice. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you've had time to consider our conversation. I told you before, he's not for sale." Bear's voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced down burning buildings and won. "I'm afraid the situation has become more complicated." Marcus gestured to the van, and two figures in dark suits emerged. They moved with the mechanical precision of federal agents, their faces hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. "These gentlemen represent the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They've received reports about an illegally possessed protected species." Bear's blood turned to ice water. Protected species? One of the agents stepped forward, pulling out a leather wallet. "Agent Reynolds, USFWS. Sir, we have reports that you're harboring a wolf pup without proper permits. Federal law requires—" "That's not a wolf," Bear interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's my dog. I found him abandoned." "Mr. Thompson," Agent Reynolds cut him off with bureaucratic politeness. Gray wolves are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Possession without federal permits carries penalties of up to $50,000 in fines and 1 year in federal prison. Scout pressed against Bear's legs, his small body vibrating with tension. The musical sounds he was making now carried an edge that made the hair on Bear's arms stand up. "I don't give a damn about your permits," Bear growled, his temper flaring. "I saved this little guy's life. If that's a crime, then your laws are bullshit." Marcus's smile widened. "Unfortunately, the law doesn't recognize good intentions. However, I might be able to help with this situation." He pulled out a briefcase, setting it on Bear's porch steps. $50,000, cash, enough to pay any fines and leave you with a comfortable cushion. All you have to do is sign the animal over to my organization. We specialize in wildlife rehabilitation." "Rehabilitation, my ass," Bear snarled. "You're nothing but a goddamn smuggler." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's facade of civility cracked, revealing something ugly underneath. "Careful, old man." "You're in no position to make accusations." Agent Reynolds stepped between them, his hand resting on his hip near what Bear assumed was a service weapon. "Sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, but that animal is coming with us today." Bear felt the world closing in around him. 2 years of grief and loneliness had finally given him something to live for, something to protect, and now these bastards wanted to rip it away. Scout seemed to sense his distress, pressing closer and making sounds that were becoming increasingly agitated. "Give me 24 hours, Bear said desperately. "Let me take him to a vet, get proper documentation of what he is. If he's really a wolf, I'll surrender him to proper wildlife authorities, not to this snake." He jerked his chin toward Marcus. Agent Reynolds exchanged glances with his partner, then looked at Marcus, who shrugged with theatrical indifference. 24 hours, Reynolds agreed. "But if you try to run, if you hide the animal, if you interfere with this investigation in any way, you'll face additional federal charges. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal," Bear replied through gritted teeth. As the vehicles pulled away, Bear slumped onto his porch steps, Scout immediately climbing into his lap despite being too big for such comfort. The puppy, Wolf, nuzzled his neck with surprising gentleness, and Bear felt his resolve crystallizing. "Fuck their permits," he whispered into Scout's fur. "You're family now." Jack's truck pulled up just as the federal vehicles disappeared around the bend. He took one look at Bear's expression and knew immediately that their fragile peace had shattered. "What happened?" Jack demanded, climbing out of his truck with the urgency of a man expecting trouble. Bear explained the visit in clipped sentences, watching Jack's face grow progressively grimmer. When he finished, Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying Scout with new eyes. "We need to get him to Dr. Redfeather," Jack said finally. "Tonight. And if she confirms what we already know—" Jack met his eyes, and Bear saw a flicker of the boy he'd once tried to raise. "Then we figure out how to protect family." The word hung between them, loaded with years of pain and possibility. Scout looked up at both of them, his amber eyes reflecting the last light of day, and made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a warning. Either way, Bear thought grimly, their quiet life in the wilderness was about to become very complicated. As evening approached and the aurora borealis began its nightly dance across the sky, Scout lifted his head and let out a long, haunting call that echoed off the surrounding mountains. It was answered almost immediately by something in the distant forest, something wild and free and utterly untamed. Bear felt his blood turn to ice as he realized the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. Scout wasn't just calling to the wilderness. The wilderness was calling back. Dr. Sarah Redfeather's clinic sat on the outskirts of Cedar Falls like a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Bear clutched Scout against his chest as Jack pulled into the empty parking lot, the puppy's warmth the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. The 24-hour deadline hung over them like a sword, and Bear knew that whatever happened in the next hour would determine Scout's fate, and possibly his own. Sarah met them at the door, her Cherokee features grave in the fluorescent light. She was younger than Bear had expected, maybe 50, with prematurely silver hair braided down her back and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from understanding both worlds, the civilized and the wild. "Jack called ahead," she said simply, leading them through the waiting room into an examination room that smelled of antiseptic and animal fear. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Bear set Scout gently on the steel examination table, his hands reluctant to break contact. The puppy, no, he had to face facts now. The creature looked around the room with those unnervingly intelligent amber eyes, taking in every detail with predatory awareness. Sarah's initial examination was thorough and silent. She checked Scout's teeth, his paws, the structure of his skull, all while maintaining the professional calm of someone who'd seen everything nature had to offer. But Bear caught the subtle changes in her expression, the slight widening of her eyes, the way her breathing quickened almost imperceptibly. "Well?" Bear demanded when the silence became unbearable. Sarah straightened slowly, pulling off her latex gloves with deliberate care. "Mr. Thompson? Where exactly did you find him?" "Highway 3, about 15 miles north of town, side of the road in the rain." Bear's voice was defensive, challenging her to contradict his story. "And you're certain he was alone? Certain as death?" "Little guy was half dead when I found him." Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with Jack, who'd been standing silently by the door like a guard. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to understand something about wolves. They don't abandon their young, ever. A wolf pup this age would never be more than a few hundred yards from his pack." "So what are you saying?" Bear's heart was hammering against his ribs. "I'm saying someone put him there. Someone wanted him to be found." Sarah's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "And I'm afraid I know why." She moved to her computer, fingers flying over the keyboard. "There's been a lot of activity in the illegal wildlife trade lately. Wolves, specifically. Gray wolf pups are worth $50,000 to $100,000 on the black market. Rich collectors pay premium prices for exotic pets." Bear felt the room spinning around him. "You're saying Scout was bait?" "Not bait, product." Sarah's words hit like physical blows. "But there's something else, something that makes this particular animal even more valuable." She turned the computer screen toward them, showing what looked like a family tree or genetic chart. "This is a genetic lineage we've been tracking for years. The Denali Alpha line, wolves with exceptional intelligence, size, and territorial instincts. They're the last descendants of the original Alaskan wolf population before human encroachment." Scout chose that moment to let out one of his haunting musical calls, the sound echoing off the clinic walls with an otherworldly resonance that made Bear's skin crawl. "That's not a normal wolf vocalization," Sarah continued. "That's an alpha call. This little guy isn't just any wolf pup, he's genetic royalty." Jack stepped forward, his face pale. "How much would something like that be worth?" "To the right buyer? $250,000? Maybe more." Sarah's expression was grim. "And there are people who would kill to get their hands on him." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and Scout's soft breathing. Bear looked down at the small creature who'd brought such joy to his life, seeing him clearly for the first time. The pointed snout, the oversized ears, the way he moved with fluid grace. How had he been so blind? "So, what happens now?" Bear asked quietly. "Now we have a problem." Sarah pulled up another screen, this one showing official forms and federal regulations. Technically, I'm required to report any wolf sighting to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They'll want to take him into federal custody. Like hell they will. Bear's voice carried the same authority that had once made rookie firefighters jump to attention. That little guy has been through enough. Bear, Jack said gently, maybe that's for the best. If he's worth that kind of money, keeping him here puts him in danger. Puts you in danger. Before Bear could respond, the lights in the clinic flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Through the windows, they could see the entire town had gone dark. Power lines must be down, Sarah murmured, but her voice carried an edge of fear. Scout's behavior changed instantly. His ears perked up, his body went rigid, and he began making a series of rapid, sharp sounds that definitely weren't barks. It sounded almost like communication. "What's he doing?" Jack whispered. Sarah's face had gone pale. "He's calling to his pack." "But you said wolves don't abandon," Bear began. "They don't, which means they're out there, waiting." Sarah moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "If this pup is as valuable as I think he is, and if the wrong people are involved, his pack might be—" A howl echoed across the valley, long and mournful, and answered immediately by another from a different direction. Then another. Within moments, the night was filled with wolf song, a symphony of wild voices that seemed to be getting closer. "Jesus Christ," Jack breathed. "How many are out there?" Before anyone could answer, they heard the rumble of vehicles approaching. Through the window they could see headlights cutting through the darkness, multiple vehicles moving fast. "We need to go," Jack said urgently. "Now!" But it was too late. The vehicles surrounded the clinic, and Bear recognized the black SUV immediately. Marcus Blackstone had returned, and this time he'd brought friends. The front door exploded inward with a crash that made Scout yelp in fear. Marcus strode in, flanked by 4 men in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles. These weren't federal agents. They moved with the predatory efficiency of mercenaries. "Dr. Redfeather," Marcus said pleasantly, as if he were making a social call. "So sorry to interrupt your evening consultation." "This is private property," Sarah replied, but her voice shook slightly. "You have no right." "I have every right." Marcus's smile was all teeth and malice. "That animal represents stolen property, specifically my property." Bear stepped protectively in front of Scout, his massive frame blocking the smaller creature from view. "Go to hell, Blackstone. Such hostility? And after I offered you such a generous deal." Marcus gestured to his men, who spread out around the room with military precision. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed. The federal agents you met earlier, they weren't really federal agents, just some associates of mine in costume. Very convincing, don't you think?" Jack's face went white with rage. "You son of a bitch. The beauty of it is that you'll never be able to prove it. By morning, you'll all have tragic accidents. Gas leak explosion, perhaps. So common in these old buildings." Marcus pulled out a pistol, holding it casually but with obvious familiarity. "Now hand over the wolf, and we can make this quick and painless." Scout let out another of his musical calls, and this time it was answered immediately. Not from the distant forest, but from just outside the clinic. The howling was getting closer, much closer. "You hear that?" Bear said, surprising himself with how calm his voice sounded. "That's his family coming to get him. You really want to be here when they arrive?" Marcus laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Wolves are afraid of humans, old man. A few gunshots will send them running." Sarah stepped forward, her Cherokee features fierce in the emergency lighting. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just any pack. These are Denali Alphas. They've been protecting this territory for generations, and they don't run from anything. As if summoned by her words, a massive shadow passed by the window. Then another. The howling had stopped, replaced by something more ominous. Absolute silence. One of Marcus's men moved to the window, peering out through his night vision goggles. "Boss, we got a problem. There's at least 6 of them out there. Big ones." "Impossible," Marcus snapped, but doubt was creeping into his voice. "Wolves don't attack humans. It's not in their nature." "These wolves do," Sarah said quietly, "when someone threatens their young." The glass exploded inward as something large and gray launched itself through the window. Chaos erupted as Marcus's men opened fire, but the wolf moved like liquid shadow, too fast for human reflexes. More shapes poured through the shattered window. The pack had arrived. Bear grabbed Scout and Jack, pulling them toward the back exit as gunfire and snarls filled the air. Sarah was right behind them, her face grim but determined. "This way!" she shouted over the noise. "My truck's out back!" They burst through the rear door into the Alaskan night, Scout still clutched against Bear's chest. The puppy was making continuous sounds now, complex vocalizations that seemed to coordinate with the chaos behind them. As they reached Sarah's truck, Bear caught a glimpse of the pack in action. 6 massive wolves working together with lethal efficiency. These weren't the Hollywood version of wolves. They were apex predators, intelligent and coordinated and absolutely ruthless when protecting their own. "Get in!" Sarah shouted, starting the engine as more gunfire erupted from the clinic. Bear climbed into the passenger seat, still holding Scout, while Jack dove into the back. As they pulled away, Bear saw Marcus stumble out of the clinic, blood streaming from his face, his expensive clothes torn to shreds. "They're not done with him," Sarah said grimly, watching in the rearview mirror as the largest wolf, a massive gray and white female, stalked toward Marcus with predatory patience. Scout let out one final call, and the female wolf stopped, her head turning toward their departing truck. For a moment, Bear could swear their eyes met across the distance, amber to amber, predator to protector. Then the wolf turned back to Marcus, and Bear didn't look back again. Sarah's truck careened through the darkness of Cedar Falls back roads, her headlights cutting desperate swaths through the Alaskan night. In the passenger seat, Bear clutched Scout against his chest, feeling the wolf pup's rapid heartbeat matching his own thundering pulse. Behind them, the glow of flames painted the horizon orange. Marcus's operation was burning, literally and figuratively. "Where are we going?" Jack demanded from the back seat, his voice tight with adrenaline and fear. "My place," Sarah replied, taking a sharp turn onto a dirt road that led deeper into the wilderness. "It's isolated, off-grid. We can figure out our next move there." But even as she spoke, Bear could see the doubt in her eyes reflected in the rear-view mirror. They were running from forces they didn't fully understand, carrying a creature that had already cost lives and would likely cost more before this nightmare ended. Scout whimpered softly, nuzzling against Bear's neck with heartbreaking trust. The old firefighter felt his throat constrict as the reality of their situation crashed over him like an avalanche. This wasn't just about illegal animal trafficking anymore. This was war, and Scout was the prize everyone was willing to kill for. "I should have listened to Pete," Bear whispered, stroking Scout's fur with trembling fingers. "Should have known something this good was too good to last." "Don't," Jack said sharply. "Don't you dare blame yourself for caring about something." "Caring?" Bear's voice cracked with bitter laughter. "Look where my caring got us. Look where it got him." He gestured to Scout, who seemed to sense the conversation's gravity and pressed closer against his chest. Sarah's cabin materialized out of the darkness like something from a fairy tale. Rough-hewn logs, smoke curling from a stone chimney, solar panels glinting on the roof. But the homey appearance was deceptive. Bear noticed the strategic positioning, The clear sight lines, the subtle defensive preparations of someone who understood that the wilderness held more than just natural dangers. Inside, Sarah immediately began securing the cabin, checking window locks, drawing heavy curtains, turning on what looked like sophisticated monitoring equipment hidden behind rustic facades. This wasn't just a veterinarian's retreat, it was a safe house. "You've done this before," Jack observed, watching her practiced movements. "More times than I'd like to admit." Sarah's voice was grim as she activated what appeared to be a radio system. "The wildlife trafficking trade is bigger than most people realize. When you specialize in protected species, you make enemies." Bear settled into a chair by the fireplace, Scout curled in his lap like he'd been doing for weeks. But everything felt different now. The weight of the small body, the intensity of those amber eyes, the soft sounds that weren't quite dog and never had been. How had he convinced himself otherwise? "I need to make some calls," Sarah continued, adjusting frequencies on her radio. "There are people who can help, but we need to move fast. Marcus had military-grade equipment, professional operators. This isn't some small-time poaching ring." As if summoned by her words, the sound of distant helicopters began to echo across the valley. Bear felt his stomach drop as the mechanical thunder grew closer. "How the hell did they find us so fast?" Jack demanded, moving to peer through a gap in the curtains. Sarah's face had gone pale. "Tracking device. Scout must have been chipped." She looked at Bear with desperate urgency. "We need to get that transponder out of him, now." "You want to operate on him here?" Bear's protective instincts flared. "He's just a baby. He's the genetic key to a bloodline worth millions," Sarah interrupted, already gathering medical supplies from a locked cabinet. "And if we don't remove that chip, they'll keep finding us no matter where we run." The helicopter sounds were getting closer, and Scout began making agitated sounds, pressing himself against Bear with obvious fear. The old man looked down at the creature who'd brought such unexpected joy to his life, and felt his heart breaking all over again. "Will it hurt him?" Bear asked quietly. "I'll use local anesthetic, but yes, there will be some pain." Sarah's voice was gentle but honest. "The alternative is worse." Bear closed his eyes, remembering every moment of the past month. Scout's trust, his playfulness, the way he'd filled the silence Rose's death had left behind. Now that innocent joy was being poisoned by the reality of what Scout represented to people like Marcus. "Do it," Bear said finally. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Sarah worked with steady hands while Bear held Scout still, whispering the same comforting words he'd used that first night. The wolf pup whimpered and struggled, but his amber eyes never left Bear's face, trusting even in pain. When Sarah finally held up a tiny electronic device no bigger than a grain of rice, Bear felt a surge of rage so pure it almost choked him. This innocent creature had been turned into merchandise, tracked like livestock, hunted by men who saw only dollar signs where Bear saw family. "That's not all," Sarah said grimly, examining the chip under a magnifying glass. "This is military-grade GPS. Whoever's behind this has government connections." The helicopter sounds had faded, but Bear knew it was only temporary. They were still out there, circling like vultures, waiting for another signal to follow. "What happens now?" Bear asked, gently bandaging the small incision on Scout's neck. Sarah's expression was haunted. "Now we have a choice. We can turn Scout over to legitimate wildlife authorities, people I trust who can protect him and reunite him with his pack safely. Or we keep running, keep fighting. But Bear?" She met his eyes with painful honesty. "If we choose to fight, some of us might not survive, and Scout will spend his life as either a prisoner or a target." Scout looked up at Bear with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and for a heartbreaking moment the old firefighter saw not a wolf, but the companion who'd saved him from drowning in grief. The choice before him felt like choosing between his own heart and Scout's freedom. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles began to echo through the trees. They were out of time. The sound of engines grew closer, and Sarah's radio crackled to life with urgent voices speaking in Cherokee. Her face went ashen as she listened, then she grabbed her rifle from above the fireplace with practiced efficiency. "My contacts are compromised," she said grimly. "Someone's been feeding information to Marcus's organization. We're on our own." Bear felt the weight of betrayal settle over him like a lead blanket. Even the people they'd trusted couldn't be trusted. Scout seemed to sense the despair in the room, pressing closer against Bear's chest and making soft whimpering sounds that tore at the old man's heart. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you earlier." Jack stepped closer, his face tense. "What?" "Scout isn't just genetically valuable. He's—" Sarah struggled with the words. "He's the last of his immediate bloodline. His parents were killed 3 months ago by Marcus's people. He's literally the only survivor of the Denali Alpha line's primary breeding pair." The revelation hit Bear like a physical blow. All this time, while he'd been playing house with Scout, treating him like a replacement for the family he'd lost, the wolf pup had been carrying the weight of his entire species' future. The loneliness Bear had seen in those amber eyes wasn't just separation from his pack. It was the cosmic loneliness of being the last of something precious and irreplaceable. "Jesus Christ," Jack breathed. "No wonder they want him so badly." "It gets worse," Sarah said, checking her weapons ammunition. "The pack we saw at the clinic, they're not Scout's birth family. They're a coalition pack. Wolves from different territories who've come together for one purpose: to protect the last alpha bloodline." The sound of vehicles was getting closer, and through the curtains, Bear could see the sweep of searchlights cutting through the forest. Scout began making more urgent sounds, no longer the musical calls Bear had grown used to, but sharp, distressed barks that spoke of real fear. "They've surrounded the cabin," Jack reported from his position by the window. "At least 6 vehicles, maybe more." A voice echoed through the darkness, amplified by a megaphone. "Dr. Redfeather, Mr. Thompson, we know you're in there. Send out the wolf and no one gets hurt." But Bear recognized the voice, and his blood turned to ice. It wasn't Marcus speaking, it was someone else entirely, someone whose involvement made everything infinitely worse. "That's not Marcus," Bear said slowly. "That's Agent Reynolds. The federal agent from yesterday." Sarah's face went white. "The real Agent Reynolds?" "I think so. Which means—" Bear's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. "Which means the federal government is in on this." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The carefully orchestrated discovery of Scout on the highway, the convenient timing of Marcus's threats, the fake federal agents followed by real ones. This wasn't just about illegal wildlife trafficking. This was about something much bigger and much more terrifying. "Scout wasn't abandoned," Bear said, the truth crashing over him like an avalanche. "He was placed. Someone wanted me to find him." "But why?" Jack demanded. Sarah's Cherokee features were grim in the firelight. "Because Bear has something they needed. A perfect cover story. A lonely old man who'd protect the wolf out of love, not greed. Someone who'd never sell him, but would fight to keep him." "A patsy," Bear said bitterly. "They turned me into a goddamn patsy." Scout looked up at him with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes, and Bear saw something there that made his heart clench. The wolf pup wasn't just afraid. He was apologetic, as if he understood that his presence had brought danger to the one human who'd shown him genuine love. "None of this is your fault, little fella," Bear whispered, stroking Scout's fur with gentle fingers. "You didn't ask for any of this." The megaphone crackled again. "You have 5 minutes to comply. After that, we're coming in." Bear looked around the cabin at the faces of the people who'd risked everything to help him. Sarah, whose career and possibly life were now forfeit. Jack, who'd come back into Bear's life just in time to be destroyed by it. All because an old man had been too lonely and too stubborn to see the truth. "I won't let them take him," Bear said quietly, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. "I don't care if it's the federal government or God himself. Scout stays with me." "Bear," Jack said gently, "maybe it's time to think about what's best for Scout, not what's best for us. What's best for Scout is not being turned into a breeding machine for rich collectors or a lab rat for government experiments." Bear's voice carried the authority of a man who'd made his final decision. "What's best for Scout is being free." Sarah moved to a cabinet and pulled out something Bear hadn't expected, a set of keys attached to a small remote control device. "There's another way," she said slowly. "My grandfather's old hunting cabin, about 20 miles north. It's right on the edge of Denali National Park. If we could get Scout there—" "His pack could find him," Bear finished, understanding immediately. "It's risky. We'd have to get past the roadblocks, through federal agents, and into protected wilderness. And even if we made it—" Sarah's voice was heavy with the weight of what she wasn't saying. "Even if we made it, we'd be fugitives for the rest of our lives," Bear said. "Is that what you're telling me?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Bear looked down at Scout, who was watching the conversation with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. The wolf pup made a soft sound, almost like a question, and Bear felt his heart break all over again. 3 minutes remaining on the federal ultimatum. 3 minutes to decide between the safety of surrender and the terrible uncertainty of freedom. "Jack," Bear said quietly, "you don't have to be part of this. You can walk out that door right now. Tell them you were trying to talk sense into your crazy old man. They'll probably give you a commendation." Jack's green eyes, so much like Rose's, flashed with hurt and anger. "After 30 years, you still don't get it, do you? You're my family, Bear. The only real family I've ever had. Where you go, I go." The words hit Bear harder than any physical blow. All the years of estrangement, all the stubborn pride and mutual resentment, and it came down to this. When everything else fell away, they were still father and son. "Sarah," Bear continued, "you've already risked too much. This isn't your fight." The Cherokee veterinarian smiled grimly. "My people have been fighting for the wolves for generations. This is exactly my fight." 2 minutes left. Outside, Bear could hear the sounds of tactical teams taking positions, the metallic clicks of weapons being readied, the low murmur of coordinated professional violence preparing to unfold. Scout let out another of his musical calls, and it was answered immediately from somewhere in the surrounding forest. The coalition pack was still out there, still watching, still waiting for their chance to reclaim the last heir to the Alpha bloodline. "All right then," Bear said, standing with Scout still cradled against his chest. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. No half measures, no looking back." Sarah grabbed a backpack already packed with survival gear, while Jack checked the rifle he'd taken from Marcus's men at the clinic. They moved with the efficiency of people who understood that the next few hours would determine whether they lived as free people or died as fugitives. 1 minute left. Bear looked around the cabin one last time at the warmth and safety they were about to abandon forever. Then he looked down at Scout, who was watching him with complete trust, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt since Rose died. Purpose. For the first time in 2 years, William Bear Thompson had something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, and he'd be damned if he was going to let them take it away. Sarah's escape tunnel opened into the forest 50 yards from her cabin, emerging beneath the twisted roots of an ancient spruce tree. Bear crawled out first, Scout clutched against his chest, followed by Jack and Sarah. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood and shouted commands echoed through the night as federal agents breached the cabin's front door. "They'll figure out we're gone in about 30 seconds, Sarah whispered, leading them through the dense undergrowth with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd grown up in these woods. "My truck's hidden about a quarter-mile north." The forest was alive with sounds, not just the natural symphony of nocturnal Alaska, but the mechanical noise of helicopters circling overhead and the distant barking of tracking dogs. Bear's old firefighter instincts kicked in as they moved through the darkness, every shadow a potential threat, every snapping twig a possible betrayal of their position. Scout remained silent in Bear's arms, but the wolf pup's amber eyes were alert and watchful, scanning their surroundings with predatory awareness. Occasionally he would tilt his head as if listening to sounds beyond human perception, and Bear found himself trusting those instincts more than his own failing senses. They reached Sarah's hidden truck, a modified Jeep Cherokee with oversized tires and what looked like armor plating welded to its frame, just as the searchlights began sweeping through the trees behind them. "Jesus, Sarah," Jack breathed, running his hands over the vehicle's reinforced exterior. "What exactly do you do for a living?" "Whatever it takes to protect what matters," she replied grimly, starting the engine with a roar that seemed dangerously loud in the forest silence. "Hold on. This is going to get rough." The next hour passed in a blur of bone-jarring terror as Sarah navigated logging roads that existed more in memory than reality, the Jeep's headlights cutting desperate swaths through the wilderness while helicopters thundered overhead. Twice they had to stop and hide under camouflaged tarps as searchlights swept past their position. Scout remained calm throughout the ordeal, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to communicate with something in the surrounding darkness. Each time he called out, Bear could swear he heard answering howls from the forest, distant but getting closer. "They're following us," Bear realized, looking back through the rear window at the coalition pack moving through the trees like gray shadows. "The wolves, they're actually following us. They're protecting their investment," Sarah said, taking a particularly vicious turn that threw them all against the door. "Scout represents the future of their species. They're not going to let him disappear into some government lab." The grandfather's cabin materialized out of the pre-dawn darkness like something from a fever dream, a structure so weathered and overgrown it seemed more part of the forest than human construction. Sarah killed the engine 50 yards away, and suddenly the silence was overwhelming. "End of the line," she announced. "From here, it's on foot." They gathered their meager supplies and began the final trek through terrain that grew increasingly wild with each step. Bear's 68-year-old body protested every root and rock, but Scout's weight in his arms felt like purpose made manifest. This was what Rose would have wanted, not the safe surrender of something precious, but the fight to protect it at any cost. The Denali National Park boundary was marked by nothing more than a weathered sign and a thin wire fence, but crossing it felt like stepping into another world entirely. Here, human law ended and natural law began, where wolves still ruled their ancient territories and government authority meant nothing to creatures who'd been free since the world was young. "This is it," Sarah said quietly, setting down her pack. "This is where we have to choose." Bear looked around at the pristine wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction, then down at Scout, who was watching him with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes. The wolf pup made a soft sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a call, and Bear felt his heart breaking all over again. "You could come with us," Bear said desperately. "Stay with the pack, but stay close enough that we could." But even as he spoke the words, Bear knew they were lies born of love and selfishness. Scout wasn't a pet to be kept or a companion to be owned. He was the last heir to a bloodline that stretched back to the dawn of North America, and his destiny lay not with a lonely old man, but with the wild places where his ancestors had run free. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and Sarah checked her watch with grim efficiency. "They've found our trail. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they surround this area." Scout looked up at Bear and made a series of complex sounds that seemed almost like language. In the distance, answering calls echoed from the forest, deep, haunting howls that spoke of pack bonds and ancient loyalties that predated human civilization. "He's calling them," Jack said softly. "He's telling them where he is." As if summoned by his voice, shapes began emerging from the forest around them. First one, then two, then 6 massive wolves padding silently into the clearing. They moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, but there was nothing threatening in their approach, only a kind of solemn recognition, as if they understood exactly what was happening. The largest wolf, a magnificent gray and white female with scars across her muzzle that spoke of countless battles survived, approached slowly. She stopped just out of arm's reach and locked eyes with Bear, amber meeting amber in a moment of communication that transcended species. "That's the pack matriarch," Sarah whispered. "Scout's adoptive mother." Bear felt tears he hadn't shed since Rose's funeral burning behind his eyes. This was the choice he'd been dreading since that night in Dr. Redfeather's clinic, between love and freedom, between keeping and letting go. Scout squirmed in his arms, not trying to escape, but trying to get closer to Bear's face. When the wolf pup licked his cheek with surprising gentleness, Bear understood that this wasn't goodbye. It was thank you. "Go on, little fella," Bear whispered, his voice breaking. "Go be what you were meant to be." He set Scout gently on the ground, and the wolf pup immediately ran to the matriarch, who nuzzled him with fierce tenderness. But then Scout did something that took Bear's breath away. He looked back and made a sound that could only be described as a promise. The helicopter sounds were getting closer, and Sarah grabbed Bear's arm with urgent desperation. "We have to go, now!" But Bear couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight of Scout taking his first steps into the wild where he belonged. The coalition pack formed a protective circle around their precious charge, and the matriarch looked back at Bear one final time. In that gaze, Bear saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life: recognition, gratitude, and a promise that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something larger than any of them had imagined. The wolves melted back into the forest as silently as they'd appeared, taking Scout with them into a world where human greed and government corruption couldn't reach. Bear stood watching until the last gray shadow disappeared, feeling empty and full at the same time. "Come on, Bear," Jack said gently. "Sarah's right. We need to get out of here." As they made their way back toward the hidden jeep, Bear felt a strange peace settling over him. He'd lost Scout, but he'd also given the wolf pup something infinitely more valuable than human companionship. He'd given him freedom. The helicopters arrived just as they reached the tree line, searchlights flooding the clearing where they'd made their goodbyes. But the wolves were long gone, carrying their genetic treasure deeper into wilderness where no government agency could follow. Bear smiled for the first time in days as he imagined Scout running free under the northern lights, part of something ancient and wild and completely beyond human control. Some things, he realized, were worth more than the hearts they cost to protect, and some loves were strong enough to let go. 6 months after that night in the Alaskan wilderness, Bear Thompson sat on his porch watching the aurora borealis paint the sky in sheets of green and gold. The cabin felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if it were holding its breath for something wonderful to happen. The federal investigation had quietly disappeared after Marcus Blackstone's body was found mauled in the woods outside Cedar Falls. Agent Reynolds had been reassigned to a desk job in Washington after questions arose about his connections to illegal wildlife trafficking. The whole conspiracy had unraveled like a cheap sweater once the FBI started pulling threads, and Bear found himself hailed as a hero rather than prosecuted as a criminal. But the real change in Bear's life wasn't the federal commendation gathering dust on his mantle or the interview requests from wildlife magazines he politely declined. The real change was sitting beside him in the other rocking chair, a steaming cup of coffee warming weathered hands that looked so much like roses it sometimes took Bear's breath away. Jack had moved back to Alaska permanently, taking early retirement from his job in Seattle to help Bear run what had become an unofficial wildlife sanctuary. The estrangement between them had dissolved like morning frost in the face of shared purpose and mutual respect. They discovered they were both more like Rose than either had realized, stubborn, protective, and absolutely incapable of walking away from something that needed help.
"Think he'll come tonight?" Jack asked, following Bear's gaze toward the tree line where shadows moved with liquid grace. "He comes when he comes," Bear replied, but his voice carried quiet confidence. "Been every full moon for 3 months now. Don't see why tonight would be different." As if summoned by their conversation, a low howl echoed across the valley, not the mournful cry of loneliness Bear remembered from those first nights, but something richer and more complex. It was answered immediately by other voices, a chorus of wild songs that spoke of pack bonds and territorial claims and the ancient rhythms of life lived free. Scout emerged from the forest with the fluid grace of his wild heritage, no longer the tiny creature Bear had rescued from the roadside, but a magnificent young wolf with amber eyes that held depths of intelligence and memory. He'd grown into his bloodline, powerful shoulders, thick coat, and the kind of presence that made other animals step aside.
But when he saw Bear, he broke into something that could only be called a grin. "There's our boy," Jack murmured, and Bear felt his throat tighten with emotion. Scout bounded across the clearing with puppy-like enthusiasm, though he was now large enough to knock Bear clean over if he chose to. Instead, he approached with the careful dignity of his species, stopping just within arm's reach and waiting for permission. "Come here, you magnificent bastard," Bear said softly, and Scout immediately pressed against his legs with the same trust he'd shown as a helpless pup. The reunion ritual had evolved over the months. Scout would spend an hour or two at the cabin, accepting scratches behind his oversized ears and sharing stories Bear couldn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. Sometimes other members of the coalition pack would emerge from the forest to watch from a respectful distance, including the scarred matriarch who'd become Scout's adoptive mother. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Scout wasn't alone. 3 smaller shapes bounded out of the forest with the reckless enthusiasm of youth. Wolf pups, maybe 4 months old, tumbling over each other in their eagerness to explore this strange place where their pack leader came to visit humans. They were beautiful creatures, their coats ranging from silver gray to deep black, their amber eyes bright with curiosity. "Well, I'll be jiggered," Bear breathed. "Scout, you old dog, you didn't tell us you'd become an uncle." The matriarch emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful dignity of a mother wolf introducing her children to potential dangers. She studied Bear and Jack with those intelligent amber eyes, weighing risks against benefits, before apparently deciding they posed no threat to her offspring. The pups approached the porch with the fearless confidence of young creatures who'd been taught that these particular humans were safe. One of them, a little female with silver markings that reminded Bear painfully of Scout's puppy coat, actually climbed the porch steps and sniffed Jack's boots with scientific curiosity. "Sarah would love this," Jack said quietly, carefully extending his hand for the pup to investigate. 3 new additions to the Denali Alpha line. Dr. Sarah Redfeather had become a regular visitor to their impromptu sanctuary, documenting the pack's recovery and growth with the dedication of a scientist and the wonder of someone witnessing a miracle. The coalition had grown to 12 adults now, with Scout taking his place as a young alpha alongside the matriarch. They controlled nearly 100 square miles of territory, and their howls could be heard echoing across Denali on clear nights. But more importantly to Bear, they were free. Scout nuzzled his hand with gentle pressure, and Bear understood the communication as clearly as if the wolf had spoken. This wasn't just a social visit, this was Scout showing off his extended family, sharing his happiness the way family members do when good things happen. "They're beautiful," Bear told him seriously. "You should be proud." The evening passed in comfortable companionship, humans and wolves sharing the same space without fear or dominance. The pups grew bolder as time passed, exploring the porch and even venturing inside the cabin under their mother's watchful eye. Jack produced a camera and documented everything with the careful reverence of someone who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. As the night deepened and the aurora borealis began its ancient dance across the sky, the pack began to gather at the forest edge. It was time for them to return to their wild lives, to the territories they protected, and the freedom they'd fought to maintain. Scout approached Bear one final time, pressing his massive head against the old man's chest in a gesture that spoke of bonds deeper than species, stronger than the human need to possess and control. In that moment, Bear felt Rose's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice whispering the words she'd always known he needed to hear. "Sometimes the greatest love is letting go." "See you next month, little fella," Bear whispered, scratching behind Scout's ears one last time. "Keep your family safe." Scout looked up at him with those remarkable amber eyes and made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a promise. Then he turned and loped back toward the forest, his adoptive family falling into formation around him with the practiced ease of a military unit. The last thing Bear saw before they disappeared into the wilderness was Scout's tail, held high and proud like a flag of victory against the star-filled sky. "Think he understands how much he changed our lives?" Jack asked after the last shadow had melted back into the forest. Bear rocked slowly in his chair, feeling a contentment he'd thought was lost forever when Rose died. "I think he knows exactly what he did. Question is, do we understand how much we changed his?" The aurora borealis pulsed overhead in sheets of green and gold, and Bear could swear he heard Rose's laughter carried on the Arctic wind. She'd always known he needed something to protect, something to love without reservation or condition. She just hadn't told him it would come in the form of a wolf pup who'd teach him that the deepest love sometimes means holding on, and sometimes means letting go. As they prepared to head inside for the night, Bear caught sight of something that made his heart skip a beat. There, pressed into the soft earth beside the porch steps, was a perfect wolf paw print, Scout's signature, left behind like a promise that some bonds transcend species and endure forever. Bear Thompson had learned to love again, and in loving he'd learned to let go. And in letting go he'd discovered that some things, the most precious things, always find their way back home. The cabin door closed behind them with a soft click, but the windows remained open to the night sounds of Alaska, to the distant howls that spoke of family and freedom and the endless possibility of second chances. In the wilderness beyond, Scout's pack settled in for the night, secure in their territory and their bonds, carrying forward a bloodline that stretched back to the dawn of the continent. And somewhere in the space between wild and tame, between holding on and letting go, love had found a way to bridge 2 worlds and heal 2 hearts that had forgotten how to hope. At 68, Bear Thompson thought his story was over, a lonely widower counting days until the end. Then a tiny wolf pup named Scout crashed into his world, teaching him the most profound truth about love. Sometimes what saves us isn't what we expected, and the deepest love means knowing when to let go. Bear's journey from devastating loss to unexpected joy reminds us that family isn't always blood. Second chances come in surprising packages, and our hearts can still grow at any age. When he finally released Scout to the wild, Bear didn't lose love. He discovered that real love creates circles that always lead back home. This story speaks to anyone who's faced the twilight years wondering if their capacity for joy has passed. Bear learned that love doesn't expire at 65, that purpose can find us when we least expect it, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is trusting something we love to be free. His empty cabin became full again, not with what he'd lost, but with what he'd gained by opening his heart to the impossible. What unexpected companion has brought unexpected joy to your later years? Have you ever had to love something enough to let it go? Share your stories below. We'd love to hear how love surprised you when you needed it most.